There are many things we pass on from generation to generation. Not all of them are good. Sadly, climate change is one of this era's legacies. Fortunately, our next guest is trying to make an impact now to slow or stop the damage. She's one of the few female leaders in the green movement. May Bouvi successfully helped launch one of the largest climate change demonstrations in history. Her life as an activist, though, started early. At only 4 years old, she wrote then-President George H.W. Bush to ask him to outlaw cruelty to animals and bugs, too, for good measure. She's one of the co-founders of 350.org, an international climate change campaign that is active in over 188 countries. As executive director of the organization, she's committed to increasing awareness about the climate change crisis and empowering people to make a difference. May is here to tell us how many of our most pressing global problems are tied to the climate crisis and how we can take action before it's too late. I want to welcome you to Full Frame.
Thank you.
I have to think if you're starting out by outlawing cruelty to bugs, that climate change is probably a piece of cake, because I still see people swatting mosquitoes.
Especially this time of year.
But at 4 years old, what possesses? I mean, most kids are still playing. I mean, what possessed you to do that?
You know, I think it was my mom reading the book Charlotte's Web to me as a little kid and being captivated by this story of how one person could make a difference in the life of something else. And so from that point on, I was always really passionate about issues of injustice, whether it was about animals or about people, and climate change combines all of that.
Let's talk about a couple of numbers. Six, the six that started this, and then the number itself. Why did you settle on that number? It's an important number. Explain why to our viewers.
Well, there's a few reasons. The first is that we already know that climate change is with us. It's here to stay, and the 350 number means that we've already gone too far, and we have to stop putting greenhouse gas into the atmosphere. So at a very basic level, 350 means the safe level of carbon in the atmosphere.
And where are we at now?
We're at 400 now and rising quickly. And that's exactly the problem, is we can't afford to keep doing this. The other reason is that we work in many, many countries, and numbers translate across languages. So we wanted to be global, and so we didn't want to call ourselves Stop Climate Change Now. We wanted a name that could mean the same thing no matter what language you spoke.
You talk about climate change, and yet there are still people out there. I can think of a senator from the state of Oklahoma, not going to name names, who says that it doesn't exist. It must be maddening for you, but tell our viewers, what are some of the impacts we're seeing on a daily basis because of this?
I'm glad you asked, because there are a lot of impacts, and I think probably everyone watching has experienced one of them at least. So I'll just name a few. Right now we're experiencing record heat. 2014 was the hottest year on record in the United States, and globally we're seeing rising temperatures everywhere. Another major impact is drought, and drought affects food production all over. So I'm from California. We're experiencing a horrific drought, and in Russia, in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen drought wipe out whole populations and make it much harder to grow food. And the third I would highlight is sea level rise, and this is already affecting people. And think of all the people who live in coastal areas. New York City is certainly one, and we saw this with Hurricane Sandy. But most of population density resides in coastal areas. So as the sea levels rise, it's harder and harder for people to live in those places.
I grew up in Southern California where, I mean, when I was young, I mean, you'd go running and you couldn't breathe. But now, I mean, the air's a lot cleaner. There are steps you can take, and they're incremental. You don't see it happen overnight. But we didn't get there overnight either, right?
Absolutely. And this is the good news about climate change, is we know exactly what we need to stop the problem. It's not mysterious at all. We have to get off of fossil fuels. We have to stop burning coal, oil, and gas, and that's what will help reduce these impacts. And the good news is, as well, we have the technology, we have the alternative. Solar power is falling in price faster than anyone expected. And so we're sitting here waiting for this transition to occur from the old economy that's making us all sick and making all those impacts I just described worse, when the alternative is right here ready for us, and it's going to create millions of jobs and really create healthier communities.
And campaigns, I know you've got a divestment campaign going. Talk to me about what was the thought behind that and what has been the impact of it?
Well, when we start to think about this basic fact that climate change is here and we know what the solution is, you begin to wonder, well, what's standing in the way? Why aren't we just changing our electricity system? Very quickly, you learn it's the political impact of the fossil fuel industry. They don't want this transition to happen. They're making all of their money, and a lot of it, by keeping our dependence on oil and coal. And so we started to think, well, what is it going to take to challenge this and to really move us forward? And divestment questions the basic morality of investing in fossil fuels. Because if we believe, which we do, that climate change is wrong and it's making people's lives worse now, it's wrong to make money from causing climate change. So divestment helps people pull their money out of what's causing the problem.
The other part of it is public policy and looking at leaders. Recently, the United States President Barack Obama and President Xi of China talked about committing to doing more. Clearly, that has to be a big step forward, because when you have two huge economies like this making that commitment, there's a trickle-down effect, isn't there? So what were your thoughts when they committed to this, and how much more do the politicians need to do in pushing this?
I think it's always encouraging when national governments are willing to take this issue head on. We have not seen this nearly enough. So that's the very good news. But the problem is quite significant. We need to be reducing emissions at a much greater level than we're seeing right now. So with these upcoming UN negotiations in Paris at the end of this year, we're really looking to see how much are politicians willing to put on the line. And we know we need to keep fossil fuels underground. We can't continue this dependence. And so that's what we're really trying to see political leaders do,
and
is
how much
rise
are
to
they,
that.
How much are they willing to put it out there on the line? Because
Yeah.
I ask you that question because you know when people are running for office here in the United States at least, they count on money for their campaigns, and this is big money.
Absolutely. So that's what we're up against. And that's where, again, the divestment campaign comes in, because we're calling into question that money. I think lobbying is something that people just take for granted, but the lobbying on climate change is particularly pernicious. Take the case of Exxon. They've known about climate change since 1981. 1981. They have been funding climate change denial organizations since that time. And so the level of duplicity is very, very high. And we're not just talking about something that doesn't affect our lives. I mean, it's affecting people's lives, this kind of duplicity. And so I don't think politicians are going to last much longer, given the impacts of climate change, if they continue to stand side by side with the fossil fuel money.
Let me talk to you about, you organized this world's largest climate change demonstration in history. It must have been incredibly daunting to put this together. So walk us through it, and then the impact. I mean, being able to do something worldwide like this, it is a global issue. That really has to have an impact, I would think.
Well, first of all, it was a very widespread effort, and we were just one group among many who helped pull it off, and that's exactly the point. The climate movement has reached a level now where there are hundreds of thousands of people involved in many, many countries on Earth. And it did not used to have that kind of appeal. You know, it was an issue kind of understood by scientists, and occasionally the press would report on it, but now it's a people's movement. And the People's Climate March, which happened last September, was a grand display of how big this movement has grown and how diverse it is. We had labor unions marching side by side with nurses and mothers and hardcore direct action activists who locked themselves to coal plants. You don't expect to see that kind of thing on display. We also saw people leading the march here in New York who are directly affected by climate change. people of color from communities who've been breathing toxic air for many, many years. So it really showed that this movement is strong and powerful.
It's interesting. There seems to be the power of social media, and it's kind of this domino thing that you could use that as an outreach to create this kind of infrastructure and put together something like this. Do you see this leading to much more of this sort of thing? And talking about the power of the people and how they might influence politicians over time.
Well, there's no question that the role that social media and digital tools play is very responsible for the widespread growth of this whole movement. And of course, there's no substitute for traditional door knocking and handshaking that has to happen. But the way that people are communicating with each other to share their news, what they're learning, there really is power there, and it's spreading all over the globe.
But what about on our daily lives, thinking about this as an issue and putting the skids on this? What would you recommend?
Well, I think there's a few ways to think about it. First of all, get involved in any number of these dynamic movement efforts. And if you visit gofossilfree.org, you can sign a petition about divestment. You could start your own campaign. So there's a whole wide range of things you can do, from something small that can take just a few minutes to something you dedicate your life to.
All right. We'll get to the bugs later. We'll take care of them at some point in life. But let's take care of climate change first. May, thanks so much.
Thank you.
We'll be right back with this week's Full Frame Close.